November 1943. Tehran, Iran. Joseph Stalin rose with a glass in his hand, surrounded by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill at a dinner table laden with food that would have fed a Soviet village for a month. The Soviet dictator, a man who trusted no one and admitted weakness to no one, was about to say something that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. I want to tell you what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done to win the war, Stalin said, his Georgian accent thick even through the interpreter. The most important things in this war are machines. The United States has proven it can turn out from 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Russia can turn out, at most, 3,000 airplanes a month. England turns out 3,000 to 3,500, which are principally heavy bombers. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the use of those machines, through Lend-Lease, we would lose this war. The room went quiet. Churchill and Roosevelt exchanged glances. Stalin had just acknowledged something the Soviet propaganda machine would spend the next 50 years trying to minimize, that American industrial might was saving the Soviet Union. But this admission came after 2 years of bitter learning, desperate need, and mounting evidence that even Stalin couldn't ignore. December 1941. Moscow. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. German forces were within 15 miles of the Kremlin. Soviet casualties had already exceeded 3 million men. The Red Army was burning through equipment faster than Soviet factories could replace it, and those factories were being evacuated east, packed onto trains heading toward the Urals, their machinery dismantled, their workers fleeing. Stalin sat in his office in the Kremlin, reading reports of the first American supply ships arriving in Murmansk. The United States had entered the war 3 weeks earlier, after Pearl Harbor. Now Roosevelt was promising aid under something called Lend-Lease, a program already supplying Britain. Stalin didn't believe it would amount to much. He had reason for skepticism. The first protocol, signed in October, promised supplies, but promises were cheap. The British had promised a second front, and there was no second front. The Americans were 3,000 miles away across an ocean. Even if they sent supplies, how would they arrive? The Baltic was controlled by Germany. The Black Sea was contested. That left the Arctic route to Murmansk, where German planes and submarines waited, or the long route through Persia, or the Pacific route through Vladivostok. And Stalin had another reason to doubt. The Americans and British wanted something. They wanted the Soviet Union to keep fighting, to tie down German divisions, to bleed the Wehrmacht while they built up their forces. The aid was self-interest, not charity. Stalin understood. Self-interest. He trusted it more than friendship. But he needed the aid. The Soviet Union was hemorrhaging. In the first 6 months of the war, the Red Army had lost over 20,000 tanks. Soviet factories, even running 24 hours a day with workers sleeping on the factory floor, couldn't replace them fast enough. The Luftwaffe had destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground in the first days of the invasion. Soviet soldiers were fighting with rifles from the First World War. Some units had 1 rifle for every 3 men. The first American supplies that arrived in late 1941 were modest. Several hundred trucks, some machine tools, raw materials. Stalin examined the reports with cold calculation. The trucks were good, better than Soviet models, but there weren't enough of them. Not yet. January 1942. A Soviet supply officer named Mikhail Korobov stood in the Murmansk docks, watching American trucks roll off a freighter. The temperature was 30 below. The Arctic wind cut through his coat like knives. But Korobov wasn't thinking about the cold. He was staring at the trucks. They were Studebakers, 2.5-ton cargo trucks, painted olive drab, still smelling of factory paint. Korobov had spent 15 years working with Soviet trucks, the Gaz and ZS models, temperamental machines that broke down constantly, that needed constant maintenance, that consumed fuel like drunkards and froze solid in Russian winters. He climbed into the cab of a Studebaker, turned the ignition. The engine started on the first try, even in the Arctic cold. The heater worked. The clutch was smooth. The gears shifted cleanly. "American engineering," he muttered to his assistant. "They build things to work." Over the next 3 months, thousands more trucks arrived. Then tens of thousands. The Studebakers and Dodges and GMCs kept coming, convoy after convoy, despite the German submarines, despite the bombers, despite the Arctic storms that sent ships to the bottom with all hands. By spring of 1942, American trucks were appearing throughout the Red Army. Soviet commanders noticed something. Units with American trucks could move faster, could carry more supplies, could operate in conditions that would have stranded Soviet vehicles. The trucks didn't break down as often. When they did break down, they were easier to repair. They could handle Russian mud and Russian winter. Stalin noticed too. In his meetings with his generals, he began asking about logistics, about supply lines, about how quickly units could be repositioned. The answers were getting better. The American trucks were making a difference, but he still didn't acknowledge it publicly. The Soviet people were told they were winning through Soviet courage, Soviet sacrifice, Soviet industrial might. Pravda ran articles about heroic Soviet factory workers, about Soviet innovations, about Soviet victories. The American aid was mentioned, rarely, and then only in passing, as supplementary assistance to the glorious Red Army. In private, Stalin was doing calculations. The numbers were becoming impossible to ignore. Summer 1942. The Germans launched their offensive toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The Red Army was still reeling, still learning how to fight the Wehrmacht. Soviet casualties were catastrophic. Entire armies were being encircled and destroyed. But something was different from the previous year. The Red Army could move. It could reposition divisions, could shift supplies, could evacuate equipment before German pincers closed. The American trucks were everywhere now, carrying ammunition, carrying food, carrying wounded, carrying whole units from one sector to another. At the Stalingrad front, Soviet commanders were using American jeeps for reconnaissance, American trucks for supply runs, American radio equipment for communications. A Soviet artillery officer named Vasily Zaitsev wrote in his diary, "Our guns fire American shells, carried by American trucks, spotted by American radios, and we are told this is a Soviet victory." The food was arriving too. Millions of tons of it. Spam, which Soviet soldiers called Second Front because it was the only second front the Americans had opened. Canned meat, powdered eggs, sugar, flour, butter. The Red Army was being fed, at least partially, by American farms. Stalin knew the numbers. By the end of 1942, the United States had shipped over 1 million tons of food to the Soviet Union. Soviet agricultural production had collapsed after the German invasion. Ukraine, the breadbasket, was occupied. Collective farms had been destroyed. Workers had been mobilized for the military or the factories. Without the American food, Soviet cities would have starved. Leningrad was already starving. The siege had begun in September 1941. By winter of 1941 to 42, people were dying at a rate of 4,000 per day. They ate wallpaper paste, leather belts, sawdust. The official ration was 4 ounces of bread per day, and the bread was half sawdust anyway. American food reached Leningrad through the road of life across Lake Ladoga. Not enough to end the starvation, but enough to keep the city alive. Enough that some people survived who would have died. Stalin never publicly thanked America for feeding Leningrad. But he knew. He knew that every ton of American food was a ton Soviet farms didn't have to produce, was labor that could be redirected to weapons production, was a city that didn't collapse. By early 1943, the evidence was overwhelming. American aid wasn't supplementary anymore. It was fundamental. The United States had shipped over 7,000 tanks by then. The Red Army was fielding them alongside Soviet T-34s. American Sherman tanks weren't as good as T-34s in direct combat, but they were reliable, and reliability mattered when you were fighting across a front that stretched from Leningrad to the Caucasus. More important were the tank destroyers and self-propelled guns. The M10 Wolverine, the M3 Lee, the M4 Sherman variants. Soviet commanders were using them for mobile defense, for rapid counterattacks, for filling gaps in the line. American aircraft were arriving too. Bell P-39 Airacobras, which Soviet pilots loved for their heavy armament and low-altitude performance. Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, Douglas A-20 Havoc bombers. By 1943, American aircraft made up a significant portion of Soviet fighter strength. A Soviet pilot named Alexander Pokrishkin flew the P-39 Airacobra and became the second highest-scoring Soviet ace, with 59 confirmed kills. "This aircraft," he said, "gave us the ability to fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms." Stalin read these reports. He read about Soviet victories won with American equipment, fueled by American gasoline, fed by American food, transported by American trucks. He read about Soviet factories producing weapons with American machine tools, American steel, American aluminum. The numbers were staggering. By mid-1943, over 400,000 trucks and jeeps delivered, over 7,000 tanks, over 7,000 aircraft, over 1 million tons of food, hundreds of thousands of tons of steel, aluminum, copper, thousands of locomotives and rail cars, millions of tons of petroleum products, 15 million pairs of boots. That last number was particularly telling. The Red Army was marching west on American boots. Stalin's generals were acknowledging the aid's importance, at least in private. Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most successful commander, later wrote, "We didn't have explosives, gunpowder. We didn't have anything to charge our rifle cartridges with. The Americans really saved us with their gunpowder and explosives, and how much sheet steel they gave us. How could we have produced our tanks without American steel?" But Stalin wasn't ready to say this publicly. Not yet. The Soviet propaganda line was that the Red Army was winning through Soviet strength. To acknowledge dependence on American aid was to acknowledge weakness, and Stalin never acknowledged weakness. The turning point came at Kursk in July 1943. The Germans launched their last major offensive on the Eastern Front, throwing everything they had at the Soviet defenses. The Red Army stopped them, then counterattacked and kept attacking, pushing the Germans back week after week, month after month. Soviet propaganda portrayed Kursk as a purely Soviet victory, won by Soviet courage and Soviet tanks. But Soviet logistics officers knew different. The Red Army's ability to concentrate forces at Kursk, to move reserves rapidly, to maintain supply lines during the counter-offensive, all depended on American trucks. The Soviet artillery that broke German attacks fired shells made with American explosives. Soviet tank crews wore American boots and ate American food. A Soviet quartermaster named Dmitry Pavlov, who later became a general, estimated that without Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union would have lost 1/3 of its industrial production. "We would not have been able to continue the war," he said. Stalin knew this. By the fall of 1943, he couldn't deny it anymore, at least not to himself. Which brings us back to Tehran, to that dinner in November 1943, to Stalin standing with a glass in his hand, acknowledging what he'd been unwilling to acknowledge before. The toast at Tehran wasn't just about machines. It was about recognition. Stalin was recognizing that the Soviet Union, for all its size, for all its population, for all its industrial capacity, couldn't have defeated Germany alone. The Wehrmacht was too strong, too well equipped, too well trained. Soviet courage and Soviet blood were essential, but they weren't sufficient. American production made the difference. American factories working around the clock, safe from German bombs, were producing more in a month than the Soviet Union could produce in 6 months. And they were sending it to Russia across dangerous seas at great cost. Roosevelt and Churchill understood the significance of Stalin's words. This was Stalin admitting dependence, admitting that Soviet survival depended on American aid. It was a moment of rare honesty from a man who built his power on projecting absolute strength. But the admission came with conditions. Stalin was acknowledging American aid at Tehran because he wanted something: the Second Front in Western Europe, the invasion of France that would split German forces and take pressure off the Red Army. The toast was partly gratitude, partly calculation. Stalin was reminding Roosevelt and Churchill that Soviet survival served their interests too. And Stalin was careful about how he framed it. He praised American production, American machines, American industrial capacity. He didn't praise American generosity or American friendship. He presented it as a practical matter. America had the machines. Russia needed the machines. Together they would win the war. No sentimentality, no ideological alignment. Just cold, strategic calculation. After Tehran, Stalin's acknowledgement of American aid became more frequent, at least in private conversations with American officials. When Averell Harriman, the American ambassador to Moscow, met with Stalin in 1944, Stalin was expansive about Lend-Lease. "This is the kind of help that really helps," he said. "One cannot but appreciate this help." But Soviet public acknowledgement remained limited. Soviet newspapers mentioned Lend-Lease occasionally, but always in the context of Soviet victories, Soviet advances, Soviet strength. The narrative was that the Soviet Union was winning the war, and American aid was merely supporting the inevitable triumph of Soviet arms. This dual narrative, private acknowledgement and public minimization, would become more pronounced after the war. As the Cold War began, as the Soviet Union and the United States became adversaries, Soviet propaganda increasingly downplayed Lend-Lease's importance. By the 1950s, Soviet textbooks barely mentioned it. The official line became that the Soviet Union won the war through its own strength, that American aid was insignificant, that Soviet victory was inevitable. But Stalin, in his final years, never fully embraced this narrative. In private conversations, he continued to acknowledge Lend-Lease's importance. Nikita Khrushchev, who attended many of these conversations, later recalled Stalin saying, "If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. One-on-one against Hitler's Germany, we would not have withstood its onslaught and would have lost the war." This was Stalin at his most honest, speaking to his inner circle, freed from the need for public posturing. He understood what the numbers meant. He understood that Soviet factories, evacuated and disrupted, working with limited raw materials, couldn't have sustained the war effort alone. He understood that Soviet agriculture, devastated by occupation and mobilization, couldn't have fed the Red Army and the civilian population. He understood that Soviet logistics, dependent on horse-drawn carts and limited truck production, couldn't have supported the massive offensives of 1944 and 45. The final numbers, tallied after the war, were even more staggering than the wartime estimates. The United States had shipped to the Soviet Union 427,000 trucks and jeeps, 13,000 armored vehicles, 11,400 aircraft, 1.75 million tons of food, 4.5 million tons of military equipment, 15 million pairs of boots, 2,000 locomotives, 11,000 rail cars, enough steel to build 90,000 T-34 tanks, enough aluminum to build 120,000 aircraft. The aid's value in 1945 dollars was $11.3 billion. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, that's over $180 billion. But the numbers alone don't capture the full impact. The aid arrived when the Soviet Union was most desperate, when German armies were at the gates of Moscow, when Soviet industrial capacity was at its lowest, when Soviet armies were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. The aid provided not just equipment, but time. Time for Soviet factories to be evacuated and rebuilt. Time for Soviet industry to recover. Time for Soviet forces to be trained and equipped. Time for the Red Army to learn how to fight the Wehrmacht and win. American trucks gave the Red Army mobility. American food kept Soviet cities alive. American explosives filled Soviet shells. American steel built Soviet tanks. American aviation fuel powered Soviet aircraft. American boots carried Soviet soldiers west from Stalingrad to Berlin. A Soviet logistics officer named Boris Sokolov later calculated that without Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union would have needed to dedicate an additional 10 to 15% of its industrial capacity just to replace what America provided. That capacity would have had to come from somewhere. Fewer tanks, fewer aircraft, fewer weapons, or a complete collapse of civilian production and mass starvation. The Red Army's offensives in 1944 and 45, the massive operations that drove the Wehrmacht back across Eastern Europe, depended fundamentally on American logistics support. Soviet armies were moving on American trucks, eating American food, wearing American boots. The vaunted Soviet steamroller was powered, in significant part, by American industry. Stalin knew this. His generals knew this. Soviet logistics officers knew this. But after the war, as the Soviet Union sought to establish itself as a superpower, as Stalin sought to project Soviet strength and independence, this knowledge became inconvenient. The official Soviet history of the war, published in the 1950s, devoted less than 3 pages to Lend-Lease out of over 600 pages. The aid was described as helpful, but not decisive. Soviet victory was attributed entirely to Soviet strength, Soviet leadership, Soviet sacrifice. This wasn't entirely false. Soviet sacrifice was immense. 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war. Soviet soldiers bore the brunt of the fighting against the Wehrmacht. Soviet courage at Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Kursk was real and decisive. The Soviet Union would have continued fighting regardless of American aid. But continued fighting doesn't mean winning. Without American aid, the war would have lasted longer, cost more lives, and might have ended in stalemate or worse. Stalin understood this, even if he couldn't say it publicly. In one of his last conversations about the war, in 1951, Stalin was asked by a Soviet general about Lend-Lease's importance. The general expected Stalin to minimize it, to repeat the official line about Soviet self-sufficiency. Instead, Stalin was quiet for a moment, then said, "They gave us so much material, without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war. They gave us so many goods that we could not have produced ourselves." It was as close as Stalin would come to a full public acknowledgement. And even this conversation wasn't made public until decades later, after Stalin's death, after Khrushchev's revelations, after the Soviet Union itself had collapsed. The truth about Stalin and American aid is complicated. Stalin was genuinely grateful, in his own calculating way. He recognized the aid's importance and acknowledged it when it served his purposes. But he was also determined to maintain the image of Soviet strength and independence, both domestically and internationally. He needed American aid, but he couldn't be seen as dependent on it. This tension between private acknowledgement and public minimization defined Soviet attitudes toward Lend-Lease throughout and after the war. It was a tension Stalin never fully resolved, because resolving it would have required admitting something Stalin couldn't admit, that Soviet survival depended on others, that Soviet strength alone wasn't enough, that the great Soviet victory was, in significant part, made possible by American machines. But in that moment at Tehran, with Roosevelt and Churchill watching, Stalin came as close as he ever would to saying it plainly. Without American production, without those machines, the Soviet Union would have lost the war. It was an admission of fact, spoken by a man who dealt in facts when he had to, even when those facts contradicted his preferred narrative. The machines kept coming until the war ended. The last Lend-Lease shipments arrived in May 1945 as Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. They arrived on American trucks, fired American-made ammunition, and wore American boots. Stalin never forgot what those machines meant. He just couldn't afford to say it too loudly.